snow came softly, like ash shaken from a great hand, cloaking the black stone and the crooked palisades until the world narrowed to breath and footfall and the wattled glow of a brazier. Jon stood with his palms to the heat and watched the flakes hiss upon iron. The cold bit more cruelly since the knife. Every breath tasted of smoke and iron and the faint salt of old blood he could not quite wash from his tongue. He had been a commander once and a corpse after, and waking had not restored any easy certainty to him. Only the memory of darkness and the feel of fingers reaching for him in empty black. Tormund's boots thudded behind him. "You brood like a winter crow," the free folk leader said, easing his bulk to the other side of the brazier. He wore no cloak, though the snow made a pale crown of his beard. "Brooding doesn't split a throat or fill a belly. It keeps a man from doing both without thought," Jon said. Tormund grunted. "I thought before Hardhome. I thought we were all dead and that was that. Then you hauled us out from under the dead thing's shadow, King Crow. Now the dead march. We should be marching too. South to the flayed man. The little lady wants Winterfell. So do I." Jon turned a coal with the iron poker. Sparks jerked upward and died. "We could take every spear we have and break them against Ramsay Bolton's walls. Or we can cut his belly without laying a hand on him." Tormund glanced at him sidelong. "You mean to starve him? I mean to cut his bread." They had spoken of this in quieter corners, with Davos warming his old hands and Dolorous Ed frowning, as if the weight of the world were just a thicker cloak. They had unrolled maps on a rough-hewn table, a curving spray of blue ink for the Green Fork, double lines for the King's Road, dots for towers and bridges. Davos had traced the coast with a blunt finger. "Ships make quieter allies than ravens," he'd said, the ghost of onion and tar clinging to every word. "A black sail in the bight won't worry the Boltons half so much as 100 boots through their snowfields." Jon felt the maps under his hands even now, parchment bending to will like a compliant thing. He felt Sansa's eyes upon him too, from the corner of the hall, a pale blue like Winterfell's sky when the wind hesitated, wide and distant and full of unsaid. She had watched him with that new coolness. The frost laid over a river so you could not see the current's drag. He said, "Roose Bolton's strength never sat only at Winterfell. His strength is bread and meat and furs and wagons to move them. The Freys are his cousins in treachery, and their bridges stitch the north to the south. Ramsay thinks to rule the north with fear, but he must feed the fear. If the twins bleed and the Riverlands burn where they sit, the flayed man has no skin to wear." Tormund's laugh was low and sudden. "You mean to fling my people into the Kneelers' wars and call it mercy?" "I mean to give them ground where they can live and fight the right foes," Jon said, and the words had the hard ring of the truth he had told himself in the long night after waking. "The Riverlands are already a battleground. The small folk there hate the Freys and the Lannister men who lord it over them. There is a brotherhood in those woods. Men who remember what was done at the Red Wedding. They will not flinch if they find wildlings in the reeds who cut the same enemies." "We don't kneel to rivers," Tormund said. "Then let them carry you." Tormund bit at an ice-crusted mustache end and spat. "Who ferries?" "White Harbor," Jon said, and felt like he said an oath. "Wyman Manderly remembers. He's no friend to Boltons. Davos will write the words he'll read. It will smell of coin and old loyalty. He has ships enough to swallow a few thousand souls and spit them out again along a coast broken by coves." "Coves is lovely talk," Tormund said. "Coves have watchers." "Not all," Jon said, "and even the watched can be blinded in a storm." He met Sansa's eyes then across the hall, and she pushed back her chair and crossed to them, the fall of her dark hair like lacquered silk against the gray of her cloak. The snow had left her cheeks raw, and the wind had learned to be quiet around her. "You would send our strength away," she said without preamble. Her voice was low, not to rouse the ragged men sleeping by the walls, not to show fear. "You would send them south into a country that will not love them to fight men who will certainly hate them and call it cutting bread." "We need the Riverlands," Jon said. "We need them in chaos. The Freys have chastened the Tullis, but the Blackfish still holds Riverrun. With pressure, he can hold longer." The Brotherhood without banners can harry their lines. If we lean upon them from seaward creeks, if we burn their bridges and baggage, Bolton's food runs thin. He calls for aid. None comes. Sansa watched him. He thought of the girl who had smiled in a summer court and the young woman who had bled on snow and still kept her feet. And if the Wildlings burn more than fry grain? She asked. If they make enemies in the Riverlands who will not forgive the Starks for unleashing them? They will fight the ones who need fighting, Jon said. Tormund knows what is at stake. And what is? Her hand had closed, he saw now, around the edge of the table. The knuckles shone pale as bone. The living, Jon said. The word had no music, yet it struck like a hammer. The dead are coming. Every day we spend building a war we can win is a day we buy against the war we cannot afford to lose. Ramsay Bolton's knives are cruel, but they have only one edge and can be broken. The Night King's blades bite in ways I have seen and cannot forget. I will not feed him the north house by house to starve the Boltons, nor feed Bolton to him by leading our people into a folly against stone and hate. We cut the bread. We starve Ramsay now so we can fight the dead tomorrow. Sansa's mouth tightened. She looked at Tormund, whose eyes were small and bright under the tangle of his brow. And you? She asked him. Will you keep your men to your word? No burning of villages for sport? No stealing daughters? I don't steal what is given, Tormund said, plainly offended. We take what we need, but you send your Southron letters, little lady, and we will send our Northmen's word. We'll keep our hands off what isn't needed. The Freys need killing. Their wagons need breaking. A bridge looks better burned than standing, in my eye. She considered him. You will take Davos, she said finally. He commands on the water, and I trust him to speak to cautious men. And you will send ravens each fortnight. Jon and I will have to call banners in the north while you are away. We must know what your cutting has cost us. Tormund scowled at the notion of ravens. Birds, he said contemptuously. But the Onion Knight smells of salt. He can come. Davos, fetched and told, only nodded. If Lord Manderly shares a cookfire with the memory of Eddard Stark, he said, we'll get our boats and more besides. The next day the courtyards filled with emotion like migration, men and women and children wrapped in furs, with bone-handled knives at their belts and old swords slung with rope. They carried what they owned because so many had already lost what they could not carry. Dolorous Ed counted them with the grim patience of a man measuring snowfall. He worried aloud and did it anyway because worry was his trade. Melisandre stood like a red flame in the snow and said nothing. Jon met her eyes once and saw a river in them running black with sparks, and a bridge on fire that he could not name. She had told too many futures to him that melted on the tongue, but the heat he'd felt in her fire after his death made him shiver sometimes, alone. By night, the wind came up from the sea and carried with it the briny hiss of the surf along Eastwatch's Sickle Harbor. A dark hull slid in with no lanterns lit, then another and another, a pod of whales rising where no man expected them. Davos took the landing with soft curses and quick hands. Men in whalebone masks, Manderleys painted the color of wave foam and iron, hauled ropes in silence and made fast. Any letters? A burly officer asked Davos in the hush of the quay. Davos pressed a sealed roll into his hand. From the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch to Lord Wyman Manderley of White Harbor, he said formally. He remembers. Then lower, and from Sansa Stark, daughter of Eddard, to the Lord who still remembers him. The man's eyes flickered, sea gray. We remember, he breathed. They loaded by torchless light, the free folk clambering up rope ladders, children tied to their mothers with bands of leather, spears passed hand to hand. The sky was moonless and the cold so deep that the deck rang like iron under boots. Tormund took a prow, a great lump of a man stamped black against black, and raised his hand to Jon on the quay. Jon raised his in answer and felt the tug as if a cord ran from his wrist to the departing hull. Stay alive, Jon said into the wind. He meant it for them, for all of them, and for the plan that depended on it as much as any heart. Tormund's laughter came back, sudden and fierce. Stay cold, he shouted. You're no good to the living if you're too warm. When the last ship faded into the east, Davos aboard, the sea folded over its wake as if no ship had ever crossed it. By day Jon wrote letters, and in the night he dreamed of water. He dreamed of rivers running in the wrong direction and of bridges built from bones. He dreamed of Sansa's face as she sealed her letters with the wolf's head pressed into wax, of the way her mouth went thin when she stepped into the wind, of Lyanna Mormont staring at them both as if she were reckoning and they were numbers on a slate. Time moved like frost creeping along a window pane, each day etching itself in a line of whirled ice. News limped in. Roose Bolton kept his seat. Rumors made ghosts of him more than once. Lord Karstark threw his weight to Ramsay. The Umbers did the same, bringing with them a broken boy with eyes like the last light over Mare's ice. Jon read the words and felt his chest go hollow at the thought of Rickon's name come into the world again, only to be made a coin in his enemy's hand. He held the quill tighter. He sent more birds. At Eastwatch, storms grew from the sea like beasts and battered the black hulls south. Davos stood with his legs braced and salt collecting in his beard, shouting over wind, coaxing men who had never seen a keel to understand how to move upon one. He was patient as the tide. Wind is a fist, he told them. It doesn't mean to kill you. It means to see if you're worth the trouble of keeping. They came around to him the way they had to the sea and learned its moods, how to crouch when a wave shrugged itself aboard, how to hold the rail and vomit without losing your knife or your pride, how to listen to the creak of a ship's ribs the way you might listen to a horse's breath beneath you. They skirted the bight and ran with low coasts kept at arm's length, hiding where they could under skeins of fog or behind the broken backs of old piers. Once, near a village with a torn-down sept, they saw a clutch of Lannister sails as red as a wound. Davos took them into a tannin-brown estuary and lay up under willows until the tide turned. Everything smelled like rotting leaves and wet leather, and the free folk hunkered uneasy. "Too many trees in this country," one woman muttered. "Trees listen." "Some do," said a man with a broken nose who had come south years ago and forgotten how to go back. "Best not to tell them your secrets." At last they crept along a coast where the land flattened and the smell of reeds grew fat. Salt pans lay sick and quiet as a graveyard, chimneys like crooked teeth. They gave it a wide berth. A night's sail later they slid ashore in a shallow cove where the banks were all mud and owl song. Men splashed over the sides with lines and made fast to a pair of old iron rings hammered into rock by some forgotten lord. Dawn bleached the east like old bone. Tormund stepped into knee-deep water and grunted when it stabbed the heat from his legs. "If this is a river," he said, "I mislike it. It doesn't know its own mind." "Three rivers make three minds and none agree," Davos said. "Welcome to the Trident." They moved fast. The first days were knives in reed beds, sap sucking at boot leather, the steady itch of bites and the reek of standing water. They learned to walk where the ground held, to float their burdens on bundled reeds when it did not. They took a small fry outpost at a ferry that had once served 10 villages and now served only carrion birds. The fry sergeant had a red face and a belly like proof that he had never had to run for his life. He died with his mouth open, trying to shout a warning that wouldn't come. Tormund's people took his bread and left the rest, as promised. On the third day, a dozen men in patched cloaks and mud-brown leather unpicked themselves from the riverbank and stood like trees given legs. One had a great yellow cloak that had once been bright and was now the precise color of old straw. Another wore a dull helm dented like a pewter cup. They held bows in hands like root and polished spears whose heads had seen better owners. They were the Brotherhood without banners, and they came out of the reeds with eyes like men who had seen too much night and learned how to use it as a blade. "Who leads?" the yellow-caped man asked, and puffed his cheeks as if he had been a minstrel once and gotten fat on poor beer. "I do," Tormund said, moving forward. "And him," he added, jerking a thumb at Davos. "On the water what we haven't got." The man in the dented helm lifted his visor. His face was all scars and stubble, and his eyes were lit from within as if by a flame not meant for this world. A thin priest with a wine-stained mouth stood beside him, smiling. "Beric Dondarrion," said the man with the helm. as if the name were a friend who arrived early to the gallows. "This is Thuras of Myr. We've had worse allies and better enemies. Which are you?" "Enemies of Freys and friends of men who keep their word," Davos said. "We come from the wall with a message. The dead walk. And while we argue about cloth and crowns, they grow more and more." Thuras' smile didn't falter. "I've believed stranger sermons with worse wine," he said. He regarded Tormund. "You stink of cold," he added approvingly. "What do you mean to do with my rivers?" "Cut the bridges," Tormund said. "Cut the wagons. Cut the fry throats. Jon Snow sends his word. We cut their bread." Beric's mouth quirked. "Bread it is," he said. "There are millers who'd kill a lord sooner than a rat for stealing their grain. I suppose it's time we made a lord of Walder Frey in their eyes." He held out his hand. It was stiff with old burns and new ones. Tormund gripped it like a wrist carved from oak. They learned each other's steps fast. Wildlings took the lead through the reeds because they understood how to move unseen in places that fought your feet. Brotherhood men taught them how to leave a trap where a man's careless step a day later would twist a knee or break an ankle and leave him to the mud. A dozen free folk archers took to the longbow as if they'd been born with taller eyes. They hunted fry patrols like otters hunt trout. They found a baggage train 3 days from the twins and fell on it with fire and rope, rolling the lead wagons into the ditch, dragging the last away like teeth pulled from a drunkard. Beric rode at the front with his sword burning like a banner, and the night lit orange and green and then went dark again, leaving only crackle and the sweet sick smell of wet flour burning. They left the millers their corn and torched only what bore the twins' blue banners. Davos enforced it with words and a knife when words weren't enough. He found them faces when they needed to speak to frightened villagers. An old woman with a scar where her eye had been who had lost both sons to fry press gangs. A cobbler whose little girl had starved after soldiers seized their winter stores for the king. The village headman counted what the raiders took and found it matched the raiders' promises, and slowly, fists unclenched. Jaime Lannister rode into the Riverlands to find not a stately siege with clean lines and polite parley, but a country like a cat's scratched back, wounds and furrows everywhere. The Blackfish had taken Riverrun in a night. The Freys were too busy counting themselves to notice. The Lannister host pitched its tents on a wet field and frowned at the sky, which chose 1 hour to spit and another to sleep and a third to fall into a sodden silence broken only by the wordless weight of water. Jaime rubbed at the leather of his golden hand sometimes without knowing it. He had always learned faster with a sword than without. He was learning patience now. Reports arrived as if borne by birds with broken wings. Fry wagons toppled in a ditch. A patrol gone and found 2 days later strung in a willow copse like thrushes. A bridge set ablaze at Old Lord Harroway's, flames creeping along tarred rope like serpents in a tail. A man with a flaming sword seen along the green fork at dusk. And strangest, men in shaggy furs, shorter bows, knives of bone and horn and old iron, who vanished into marsh and willow when the horns blew. The small folk whispered of river spirits and wolf giants. Jaime thought of wildlings and frowned. He sent out a column of cavalry to chase ghosts. They came back with mud to their stirrups and tails between their legs. Their captain with a slash across his cheek and eyes so bright with anger, he could not see where to aim it. "They don't fight like men," he spat. "They fight like reeds. You strike and they bend, and when you look away, they cut you." "Then stop looking away," Jaime said, and dismissed him. On the 4th week, a parley flag rose from the marsh edge like a white lily. Jaime rode with 5 men and a white flag of his own and found a strip of dry bank tall enough to count as a hill in this country. A large man with hair like an unsuccessful winter and teeth like tombstones waited, fur-clad and grinning. Beside him stood a man Jaime had met once at a wedding and thought dead since. Beric Dondarrion with his tired eyes and that ridiculous flaming sword guttering down to a sullen coal. "You," Jaime said to Beric, "how many times do you mean to die before you stay dead?" Beric's smile had no mirth left in it. "Enough to balance a ledger that will never close," he said. The big man in furs thumped his chest. "Tormund Giant's Bane. Some call me Tall Talker and Thunderfist and Hornblower and Breaker of Ice," he said. But you can call me the man who's going to cut your bread if you don't get out of my rivers." "Your rivers," Jaime repeated pleasantly. "Forgive me, I thought these belonged to the Tullus, or the Freys, or whatever head the lion has his paw upon this week. They belong to the people who drink them," Tormund said, "and to the dead who will drink us if we're fools. We're not fools." "You burn bridges," Jaime said, and kept his voice light. "Men need bridges. Not if they mean to come and kill our friends," Tormund said. "They can drown for all I care." "And the small folk?" Jaime asked. "Do they drown too?" Davos stepped forward, gray as weathered rope, his face open as an honest ledger. "We've left them their millstones and their winter stores when we could," he said. "We leave their daughters alone and we take only what the Freys will miss. Ask in Martin's Ford. Ask on the Blackwater Rush. We cut war. Sir Jaime, we're as careful as a man with a dull knife can be." Jaime's golden hand was cold. He flexed it. "If I wanted careful, I wouldn't have brought Freys," he said dryly. He looked past them toward the reeds. "Tell me one thing. Why the Riverlands? The north is where your wolf wants his bone back. Why not go there?" Tormund's grin showed a broken canine. "Because wolves eat better if the flock is thin," he said. "And because your Lord Fry is a man who needs reminding that blood remembers even when banners forget. We remind him." Jaime's horse shifted under him. The saddle creaked. "You'll bring the north on your heads when you're done," he said. "Bolton men will call you raiders. River lords too. What else would they call wildlings?" Tormund laughed. "Names are wind. Will be gone like wind. But a bridge that is ash stays ash. A wagon burned stays burned." Jaime felt the weight of duty like an old sword at the hip he no longer had. "If you strike at my supply lines, I will strike at your base. Wherever you hide your ships. Whatever harbor welcomes you. Try," Davos said, and there was a quiet, flat steel in it that did not need a blade to ring. "And while you're searching harbors, measure the anger of small folk who watched your friends burn their barns for a tax they could not pay. That fire will run ahead of you." They parted with nods that were not respect but the acknowledgement of iron on both sides of a field. Jaime knew he could not spare enough men to scour every reed bed from Maidenpool to the Twins. He tightened the siege at Riverrun instead, turned his mind to Edmure Tully and the lever he represented. War was a carpenter's trade as much as a butcher's. The trick lay in knowing whether to cleave or to pry. Brienne of Tarth, meanwhile, rode through gray days that smeared into one another like dirty fingerprints, carrying Sansa's letter under her tunic. She found the Blackfish by the water gate, staring at the river with an expression that made a weapon of patience. When she gave him the letter, he did not weep. He did not even sigh. He read and folded and tucked away and looked up at her with blue eyes hard as bright ice. "She lives," he said. "She lives," Brienne said. "And she asks for men we cannot spare. And you ask me to leave this place that is my last proof that we still remember who we are." He scratched his beard. "She is a Stark. The Freys killed my sister's son. The wolf fed the river with red enough for a generation. I would go now to Winterfell if I could, blade bared, and die with her name on my tongue. But I cannot. And Jaime Lannister puts his own blade to my throat by way of my nephew." "You could escape," Brienne said. "There are people in the reeds who will hide you. I have seen them. You ride like a knight in a song," Blackfish said gently. "I am a soldier in a country without songs. But perhaps—" He glanced toward the wall walk, where Fry banners flapped like loose tongues. "Perhaps war will make a song we can stand." At night that same week, Thuras and Beric led Tormund's raiders to a narrow bridge downriver that carried more than its load. Beeves on the hoof and a train of mules, sacks of barley, a dozen kegs of lamp oil. They waited until the wagons were midway, then let fire creep along ropes dipped in tallow. Flames ran like foxes. The lamp oil went quick as breath, a humph and a howl. The bridge became a shout of light. Men leapt into dark water that received them without kindness. The burning arc reflected in the green fork and made it seem for a breath like a seam burned through black cloth. From a hill farther off, Jaime watched the flames rise and the bridge sag. He did not swear. He felt the old anger flicker, the anger of a man who had once been swift and sure and loved nothing more than the clean answer a sword could give. Now he lived among slow answers and compromises that tasted like old pennies. "Send riders to the twins," he said. "Tell Lord Walder to guard his own bread for once." He looked at the river. "And send to King's Landing," he added reluctantly. "Tell them the Riverlands bleed and may take more bandages than we packed." In Winterfell, Ramsay Bolton fed his hounds meat that had once been men who had displeased him. He read a letter by that light and laughed because he liked the sound of it. "We have wolves in the rivers," he said. "Imagine, wolves who swim, and my poor cousins cannot tell one mud-brown thief from another. Father, you might have found this amusing." He did not say that aloud, because he was not a fool even in his most private moments. He sent men to answer every rumor. The Karstarks marched to hold the King's Road north of Moat Cailin. The Umbers ranged the bleak downs east. In sending them, he weakened the hand he held tight upon Winterfell. Snow fell and stayed. Sacks grew light. The kitchen women spoke of rats and hard bread. The iron in the larders began to show through where pork had been stacked and removed and left a smell that confused the dogs. Ramsay wrote a letter then, a bastard letter with words chosen like hooks, and loosed it upon ravens like a fisherman upon a river full of fools. Jon read it by torchlight and felt his hand shake. He did not throw the letter into the fire. He folded it carefully and placed it upon the table as if it were a map of a country he might one day leave but never forget. "We go," he told Sansa. "We go whether the Vale comes or no. We go whether the Manderleys open their gates. We go because he has Rickon. And we go because he will not stop until there are no Starks left to send letters." Sansa's silence had weight. When she spoke, it was a blade laid flat. "If we go without the Vale, we lose," she said. "If we go slow, we lose my brother. If we go fast, we lose our men. Every path is a wound." "It is," Jon said. "Choose where we bleed." She left the room then and returned with parchment and ink. She wrote in a hand that had once copied Septus Pieties and now wrote threats with equal care. She sent for Peter Baelish to come and stand in the snow and listen while she told him what his silence had cost her and what his aid would cost him. She made in her face a thing that had learned to break stone without a hammer. Tormund and his river wolves left more bridges ash and took more wagons. They did not touch village storehouses which bore marks agreed upon with careful heads. 3 slashes for one village, 2 circles for another. Davos made them. "We are thieves," he told them. "But we are honest thieves. Honest thieving wins wars. The other kind makes enemies with long memories." They fought the Freys twice in fields of dead corn that had turned black with wet. The Freys formed squares and made a bristle of spears, and green boys pulled bowstrings to their ears and loosed too soon. Beric's sword flared and wavered and flared again. Thuras stumbled and laughed and sang. Tormund took a spear in the arm, broke the shaft in his own flesh, and kept fighting. They won not by killing everyone but by killing enough to scatter the rest. They took 10 dead and left 40. Davos burned the dead himself, for he had learned a new caution since a king had played with fire and lost. Word passed. River lords with old grudges slipped messages into Beric's hands. A stable boy's whisper, a knot of twine with 3 turns. "We will not aid the Freys," the knot said. "We will not close our gates to you, but we will not open them either." War made cowards of many. It made wise men too. Tormund thought he preferred cowards. Wise men were worse to drink with. Old Stones lifted its broken ribs by the river with the melancholy of a dead thing that did not know enough to fall down. There Tormund camped one night, and a small thin man with a harp came and sang about Jenny and her ghosts in a voice that slid like water over a stone. The free folk huddled to listen because the sound was soft and not unlike wind in a glacier. Tormund did not say he felt a sadness then. He had not felt even when he left the bodies of his brothers in Hardhome for the snow. He did not have words for that sadness, and if he had, he would have thrown them away rather than let the kneelers hear. "Ghosts like that are honest," Davos said quietly beside him. hearing the song as if it were a coin he could weigh. They haunt only what they loved. It's men living who haunt everything they hated as well as loved. Ha! Tormund said, to shake the weight off. He slapped Davos on the back so hard the old knight wheezed. A week later, Sansa stood beneath bare oaks that had grown out of a hill where stones leaned like old sheep and faced Peter Baelish. The Vale men stood a little apart with steel tasting the air. Peter wore a black cloak that drank the light. "You sold me," Sansa said, and the snow accepted the words and made them colder. "You sold me to a man who put me on a bed and cut me until he liked my voice." Peter's mouth shaped regret that sat prettily upon it. "I misjudged Ramsay," he began. She cut the words in half with a small movement of her hand. "Say his name again," she said, "and I will have Brienne cut your tongue free and feed it to my wolves." He bowed his head because he thought bows were currency and he had many to spend. "What do you want, my lady?" "Your men," Sansa said, "all of them, and their oath that they will take no wife nor Winterland from the north when they have done. You will follow my banners and mine alone. In return you will have my forgiveness and the chance to be near the thing you love most." His eyes lit at that, and she felt something tug at the air like a hair in the wind. She did not flinch. "I mean Winterfell," she said, and saw the disappointment like a flicker when a candle guttered. "You will stand in its hall and know you let it be bled and helped wash it after. If you do not come, you will never see it again." He smiled then because his face knew only two tricks. "It will be as you say," he said. "The knights of the Vale ride to war." In the Riverlands, Jaime pushed his lever. Edmure Tully broke at last. Whether through calculation or despair, Jaime did not know. The Blackfish refused to bend. He died as men like him did, with his sword in his hand and his promise to his sister in his mouth. Or so the men who found only blood at the Watergate said. Others swore they had seen him slip away with his gray head bent like a swimmer's beneath a cloak of reeds. In years to come there would be two songs and no proof cruel enough to silence either. Jaime entered Riverrun under a flag that had changed colors 3 times in an hour and closed his hand on it with his gilded fist. He turned his mind to the rebels in the marshes and found that his patience had grown heavy as chain mail. Then a raven came blacker than most with a letter sealed in white wax. The queen called him back. The faith had made a theater of her shame, and she meant to answer with a tragedy of her own. She required actors. Jaime looked out over the river and thought of Freys being as useful with their own bridges as a man with 3 thumbs. He left thick-headed orders and a thick-headed fry to follow them, and turned south for the city that had not forgiven him and would never. Winterfell rose out of white like a memory of black. Ramsay came out to fight because he knew victory felt best when it happened where everyone could see. He had more men, more horses, more banners that flapped with ugly promise. Jon's army looked like a shepherd's after wolves had been and gone. Patchwork, the Knights of the Vale gleaming on the right like a swallow's wing in sun, northern houses on the left, more pride than spearheads, wildlings in the front with bone and grit and hungry eyes. The snow muffled sound until it held nothing but the creak of tack, the rasp of breath, the tight cries of men pretending to be brave because there were others to hear them. Jon remembered the letter and Rickon's name and swore not to run into a trap this time because he had learned how death felt and he had no urge to feel it again unless it was needed. He held the center. He held his own men so tightly with his eyes they shook with wanting to go. Sansa sat a horse beside him like a carved thing in winter, her face set. She did not watch the enemy. She watched the flanks, the ridgelines, the angles where a friend would come if he meant to. She had learned something from maps too. When Ramsay loosed Rickon, no man knew which heart in the field broke first. The boy ran with his arms pumping, his head back. The world narrowed to hoofbeats and the thin whistle of air under feathered wood. Jon's horse moved without will, and for a heartbeat Jon led it. Then he hauled it back, throat raw, and saw the arrow take his brother through the back and out the chest. The boy folded with a simplicity that was unendurable. The snow accepted him the way it accepted everything, without judgment, without softness. Jon closed his eyes. When he opened them, his face was glass. He gave no order to charge. He gave an order to hold. In his chest, his heart was trying to break itself free like a bird against a shutter. He held. Ramsay cursed. He had wanted the wolf to break himself upon his spears like last time. He wheeled his cavalry and sent them, spurred by rage rather than reason. Jon lifted his hand and dropped it, and the Vale Knights uncoiled like something that had slept in shadow too long and liked the sun very much indeed. They came down the right flank like night over a camp, and men cried out and vanished under iron. The center met like two tides, spears and shields and flesh flattening out into a press that had no room for breath. Tormund did not think of rivers then, he thought of knives. He took a man under the arm where the steel did not reach and ripped. He took a breath that tasted of wool and copper. One roared, and the sound made the ground forget what it was. Arrows stuck in the giant like a barber's pins on a wig, and still he came, pulling men off horses like thistles off a cloak. Davos rode along the rear with his teeth bared not in a grin and shouted to hold ranks when the snow made the world spin like a coin. They might have been ground to paste between shield and shield if Sansa had misjudged by a minute. She did not. The Vale doubled, turned what had been a hammer into a pincer. Men who had laughed at her in council died with her name in their mouths, though not one would admit it if the stranger asked. Jon saw the opening as if the snow itself had pointed. He drove forward with the last of his horse. Winterfell's gates loomed. One reached them and tore, his hands bleeding like slaughtered oxen, his breath fog, his eyes stupid with hurt and purpose. Ramsay fled inside and let the gates fall shut behind him. It did not help. One pulled wood and iron down like a man breaking a loaf. The gate splintered and he came through, more arrows in him than he had room to hate. He died on his knees, head tilted back, looking at a sky that had nothing to say. Jon stepped around his body and into the yard where he had once learned to fight with a stick. Ramsay's smile was a scythe. "Shall we end this with a duel?" he asked. Traditional, satisfying. Jon did not answer with words. He closed and slammed his shield into the bastard's face, and the grin turned red and broke. He hit until the snow near Ramsay's head was a slurry. He stopped because Sansa's hand was on his arm and because he remembered the dead he had met and did not want to meet them again already. They put Ramsay in his own kennels in the end because Sansa asked. "I have words," she said, and went in and left the dogs a better meal than they had had in weeks. When she came out, she did not look back. Jon did not ask what she had said to the beasts. He did not need to know the language of hunger. They lit fires in Winterfell's halls, and the smoke went up through holes that had seen so much already they could not be shocked. Wyman Manderley came in a week later with carts of flour and salt fish and quietly occupied the corner by the kitchen where the women minded cloth and whiskey and gossip. He looked at Jon with his small sharp eyes and at Sansa with eyes even sharper, and he bowed to them in the plain fashion of a man unaccustomed to bending for anyone but his own belly. "The North remembers," he said, "and the Riverlands do too, from what I hear. Bridges burning all over like winter candles. Who thought Wildlings would bring back chivalry?" "Not chivalry," Davos said, smelling always of ropes and weather. "Just simple arithmetic." Jon stood in the hall where his father had once stood and felt only the weight go shifting inside him. A new burden replacing an old. Men hailed him king because they wanted someone to stand between them and the snow. He took the words not because he loved them, but because he feared who else might take them if he did not. He looked at Sansa and saw something like pride in her for half a breath and almost smiled. They did not get to linger amid their fires. The raiders in the Riverlands did not vanish when Winterfell fell and the Vale went home beneath banners unwrinkled by blood. Tormund sent ravens with words scrawled like the path of a drunk spider. The phrase had bled. Walder raged and counted and sent suns in circles. Rumors came in alongside the casks. Of a girl with a face like a knife who had poured a man's throat out into his own cup. Of pie at a feast that had a fry inside it. Of banners taken down in the night and found in the morning tied around a dog's neck. The twins grew paranoid, which was not so much a change as a habit made visible. Beric wrote once to the hall at Winterfell, "We can hold the crossings ruined for a season more, perhaps two, and we can keep their wagons light. But winter thickens, and the dead do not stop at lines drawn on puddles. When you are ready to stand, send word. We will come. I owe Robb Stark my sword and his house my memory. My life is not mine anyway. Thuras added at the bottom, in a hand that looped lazily, your northern ale is horse piss. Send better. Jon kept that letter the way a man keeps a coin that has paid for something dear. He sent back, build boats. Burn bridges only when you can afford to swim. Keep friends and make more. He sent what grain he could spare by ship through the Bight with Manderly's stealth. He sent Fletchers to show the free folk a better arrowhead and smiths to show them a better rivet. He sent a man south who knew the neck as if it had been his mother's hair, to find a Cranaglord with a reed for a heart and a stone for a purpose. He sent more than he could afford, and still it was not enough because nothing would be, because winter was a big hand closing. Sansa walked Winterfell and stitched it back together with thread that did not show. She counted flour and counted faces and paid for both with promises she meant to keep. She sat with Wyman Manderly at night and spoke of ships that could slip through ice and how to hide 100 men in a whale's shadow. She spoke with Lyanna Mormont and learned how to listen to a girl who refused to be a girl when she could be a bear. She spoke with Lord Glover and forgave him without forgetting. She went to the Godswood sometimes alone until she realized she was not alone. For the heart tree had a face and faces see things. She told it nothing and it told her nothing back. That was a relief. The first White Walker the scouts brought to Winterfell's ditch fell apart like glass when dragged into the hall, leaving a smell like winter made a corpse. No one needed a speech then. Jon went along the long tables and put his hands on shoulders and said the words a man says when he wants to make other men stand in a wind that will kill the He did not promise victory. He promised to fight, and that was all. That would not be a lie. A raven came from the Riverlands when the snow had made the world a single color and the nights were longer than stories. It was short. The twins are quiet, too quiet. We smell a trap but do not know for whom. We hold and wait. Thuras has learned to make soup from belts. Beric says he misses dying. Send us news worth the cold. Jon laughed when he read that and it surprised him. He penned a reply in the kitchen while the ovens made the air into bread. He told them of one, whom the small folk had begun to call one stone because it felt blasphemous to call a giant by anything else, and of how the giant's death had moved even the dogs to silence. He told them how he had stood in the Godswood and asked the old gods for nothing because he had learned the gods choose what to give. He told them that Sansa had ridden a horse along the battlements until the beast knew every stone under its hoof, and that he suspected she did it for her own heart more than for any show of power. He told them that when the wind fell still sometimes he could hear water moving far away under the ice like a voice deciding whether to speak. In the Riverlands, Beric folded the letter and held it in hands that had carried too many letters to graves. He writes like a Stark, he said. He writes what is true and leaves out what is pretty. Thuras blew on his soup and made a face. I would kill for onions, he said. You have killed for less, Beric said mildly. They survived as men do, by making jokes smaller than their fear and sharing fires without asking too many questions of the men on the other side of them. Tormund told stories that were obscene and true. Thuras sang a hymn to a god who had never learned their names properly. Davos taught young men knots. The Brotherhood taught wildlings which mushrooms would kill you and which would only make you see your grandfather. Together they dug pits and laid branches across them and covered them with snow and laughed when fat fry horses went down with their masters following. They grew thin, the way all men do when they trade their flesh to purchase a winter. Walder Frey grew suspicious enough to stop leaving his high table to piss. He had a privy stool set behind a screen and used it loudly. He counted and recounted and asked twice a day about banners and wagons and what bridges still stood. If the Lannisters won't come, he said, spitting into his soup, then we will remind these river rats whose piss runs in their streams. Send Black Walder. Send him with 30 men. If he does not come back, I will send him no more. He slept less well, which meant everyone else slept worse. On a night when the wind howled over the twins and made the towers sing like tuned bottles, a cook who had once baked pies in White Harbor set a dish before Lord Walder that steamed like forgiveness. He ate with relish and laughed with his mouth open. It was a miracle his teeth did not leap out and make a run for it. Whether a girl with a face like Winter gave him a lesson or not was something the Riverlands argued over by firelight for years afterwards, when they had the luxury of arguing. What they did not argue over was this. The Freys had no friends outside the stones of their bridges, and when the true winter rode south, fewer men than anyone expected chose to die on the Twins for a lord whose name tasted like spoiled cream. The Riverlands grew quieter in a way that was not peace. The burned bridges lay under snow like bones under a sheet. Jon looked south from the top of Winterfell's gatehouse and pictured men crossing on ice and dying because of it. He pictured men like Tormund and Davos pulling others from those waters, cursing them for being fools and welcoming them anyway because there was nothing else to do. The dead came. They do not need the courtesy of story to announce them. They came in the sound of ice giving up and in the way frost feathered along a man's beard and did not melt even by the fire. They came and the sky dimmed and did not brighten though the hour said it should. They came and the Night's Watch oath became relevant to men who had never waded beyond a fireside jest. When the horns blew at Winterfell, it sounded like a world turning in its sleep and finding the bed colder than it remembered. Men climbed the walls and pulled furs tight and set their shields along the parapet. Women carried arrows. Children kept the kettles filled with hot water because heat is a weapon against anything that loves the cold too much. Jon walked along the wall and put his hand on each man's shoulder again. He did it because someone had to be seen, and because the touch told him something each time. A tremor, a steadiness, a fear. He found Ed and gripped him longer than he meant. Ed nodded with a bleak humor that had survived everything. "At least we won't have to listen to the phrase," he said. "Small blessings," Jon said. Sansa stood at the Heart Tower with a bow. She had learned to draw it with her whole back and to anchor the string against her mouth, so the shot would find its own way along a path already made. She did not think of the man she had left to his own hounds. She thought of Rickon running and of how the wind had made a sound then that no one else had heard. In the midst of the fighting, when the dead pressed and broke and pressed again, a horn sounded from the south, thin as a reed and then louder, swelling like a river in thaw. Men on the walls turned their faces and shouted until voices frayed. Out of the white came banners that were not wolves and not bears, the patched standards of the Riverlands and the rough ones of men who had no banners at all. The Brotherhood without banners rode in pairs and threes with fire upon their blades and torches lashed to their spears. Behind them came Tormund and what remained of the river wolves, lean and wrapped in furs stiff with rime, their eyes bright and savage with the joy that comes not from killing but from arriving in time to make killing mean something. Davos found Jon on the wall and grinned like a man who had cheated at dice and been forgiven by the gods for wit. "They came," he said. "After all the bridges we burned, they found a way." "The river carries," Jon said. He did not realize he had said it aloud until Davos laughed. "Sometimes it drowns you first," Davos said. "But the dead did not care for banners and did not care for speeches. They cared only for cold and for ending. They came and broke against fires and steel and the stubbornness of those who had learned that the only answer to the void is the noise you make pushing it back." Thuras set a pyre in motion at the base of the wall and sang. Beric burned and flickered and burned again. Tormund roared laughter. Ed cursed to himself in a litany that sounded like prayer. Sansa loosed and loosed again until her fingers bled, and only then did she realize she had been crying. Jon moved like a man in water which supports and resists both. His sword a bright question whose answer kept coming back the same. Morning came eventually because even winter gets tired. The dead lay where they had fallen or blew away like dust when a breath touched them. The living leaned on spears and each other and found that breath again with surprise. In the afternoon, when the snow made a delicate lace along the broken crenels, Jon stood in the yard with Sansa and Tormund and Davos and the men who had followed him from a black stone courtyard where he had first thought to starve another man of bread. He thought of what the Riverlands had given them: time, confusion to their enemies, and friends who had learned they could stand in a field not theirs and still make it their own by wanting to live there long enough. "You made a mess of their rivers," Sansa said to Tormund. There was no censure in it, only observation. "Aye," Tormund said, "but it washed clean after." He looked up at the sky with a frown, as if checking whether it intended to collapse upon them.
"I miss like green places,"
They got too many hiding places. You did well, Jon said. Tormund snorted. Say that again when we've all got a spring to walk into, he said. For now, I'll take a hot cup and something chewy to gnaw that isn't old man's leather. And a girl, if there's one who doesn't mind a little frostbite. Take the cup, Sansa said, not quite smiling. If you find the rest, keep it to yourself. At dusk, Beric came to Jon with a face thinner even than it had been and said, Lady Stoneheart sends her regrets for not meeting you sooner. He watched Jon closely when he said it, to measure whether the Stark of Winterfell knew the nature of the Riverlands' fiercest ghost. Jon's face did not change. Beric nodded, as if that were the right answer to a question he had been asked long ago and only now remembered. What you did, Jon said. In the south, you kept him short of bread. You made him send men into storms who would have held his walls. You gave us time. Thank you. Beric shrugged, as if he could slough off gratitude like an old cloak. We paid for each bridge with a man, he said. Sometimes two. That seems right. Bridges demand tolls. The trick is to cross them anyway. They buried their dead as best they could and burned those the cold would not let them bury. Winterfell's chimneys blew a smoke that was more than smoke. It was a kind of hymn, low and practical. In the Godswood, candles made small flames in the hollows of the heart tree's roots, and a girl with hair the color of a red autumn leaf came in and stood with her head bowed and her fists clenched until an old woman put a hand on her shoulder and led her away. Jon sat alone in the great keep after and listened to the building settle around him like an animal finding a position that did not ache. He did not feel like a king. He felt like a man who had found a bridge and set it on fire because he'd had to, and who had watched the flame carry itself along the ropes and had wondered whether it would reach a part of him he'd thought safe. He could still smell river mud and lamp oil if he closed his eyes. He opened them and found Sansa in the doorway, her pale cloak thrown back, hair loose and heavy on her shoulders. She came to stand by the table where their father had once stood and taught them where in the world they began. They will tell the story wrong, she said, and her voice was a ripple in a pool made still by snow. They always do. They will say you went south when we should have gone north, and that we fed wild wolves into a country already bitten to bone. They will say we burned bridges and left men to drown. They will, Jon said. He looked at her and it seemed he had never looked at her properly before, not with the eyes that understood that people were not fixed things. And we will know that we gave the living a place to stand while they threw stones at the dark. She nodded, her mouth small. We cut the bread, she said. That was your phrase. It will do. He thought of Tormund's laugh and Davos' dry sayings and Beric's sad, burning eyes. He thought of Rickon in the snow and of a bridge on fire whose ashes had floated down to touch 1,000 reeds. He thought of the river carrying what is thrown into it, whether men like the direction or not. He thought of winter and of how even winter yields sometimes to roads and men who mean to walk them. We'll need more, he said. We always do, Sansa answered. We'll find it. Outside, the wind moved through the merlons and made a sound like a harp string being plucked by a careful hand. Somewhere in the yard, a boy laughed because his friend had slipped and landed with his arse in a drift, and the laugh carried. It seemed almost sacrilege, and yet it warmed the stone. In the blackness beyond the walls, the dead had retreated to consider their next move, as heedless of stories as of bridges. In the south, the Riverlands lay under snow, their burned arches quiet as healed bones, their currents slow and dark and deep. Spring was a promise that meant nothing yet and everything eventually. Jon rose. He did not know what kings did at such moments because the stories always cut to the battle or the bed. He knew only what men did. They went where the work was and they did it until their hands bled, and then they wrapped the hands and did it again. He put on his cloak. He felt the weight of it and found it acceptable. He walked with Sansa into the cold, and the door shut behind them with a sound like stone agreeing. The night took them both as it takes everything, and the torches made little suns along the yard. Men bent to their tasks and the walls held steady as if they had chosen to stand because the people behind them had. In the far distance, where water ran under ice and did not freeze, a sound like a sigh rose. It might have been a river. It might have been the world. readying itself for the next attempt.